and welcome to CheersToFearYT, where we take horror films and turn them into drinking games. We're your two hosts. I'm Alex.
And I'm Tucker. Today we will be making a drinking game for the new Candyman movie that was released in 2021. The movie is directed by DaCosta and written by DaCosta, Win Rosenfeld, and most notably of the bunch, Jordan Peele. Peele is known for his work on Get Out and Us, which were both released in the 2010s to great reviews, making him one of the upcoming horror directors to watch.
Back to Candyman. This movie takes place in present time as we hear about the previous movie that took place in the past being told to us.
And the legend is, if we say his name 5 times while looking in the mirror, we could summon him.
Summon the Candyman.
And there are some elements that are off about this version, such as Helen Lyle being a psychotic killer, which we know was not the case. Intrigued by the story of Candyman, Anthony decides to not only say his name like Helen did in the past, but also investigate more into the story of Candyman.
I feel really connected to this story.
God.
After being stung by a bee, Anthony starts changing for the worse. He starts to get obsessed about painting Candyman for his art show and starts acting irrationally. He then finds out that he unleashed Candyman back into the world as he is now being haunted by him.
The 2021 Candyman movie is out in theaters now, so we recommend that you go out and catch it in theaters before watching our video. However, we should add that we're not going super deep into spoilers, as we try to avoid them for our newer movies, so you were able to watch them without being spoiled. To further reduce the amount of spoilers for this movie, we also did not add the amount of drinks that we had for each rule. With that out of the way, let's see what we came up with for the rules for the new Candyman movie.
Our first rule won't surprise many people. You drink for each death is always going to be the first drinking rule we have for every horror movie. For Candyman, there were some kills that are more gruesome than the first movie, which is to be expected by somebody that carries around a hook. And the movie is not held back by how much special effects have changed over the years.
Another rule that will not surprise anybody is every time you hear or see somebody scream, cry, or yell, take a sip. This is the other one of the 2 rules that we will use for each and every horror movie drinking game that we create.
Now, we will be bringing back some of the rules that we had for the other Candyman drinking game that we created last week. One of those returning rules is that if you see the bees, you must take a sip. In this installment of Candyman, bees felt a lot more prominent than in the 1992 version.
Again, if somebody says Candyman, you take a sip.
Candyman, 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 Candyman.
Regretfully, this rule is coming back, and it is likely getting mercy ruled in some scenes, because if you are drinking more than 5 times in a single rule in a single scene, it becomes a little bit too much to drink and a little bit too repetitive.
One rule that is both coming back and is more well balanced is that if Candyman shows up, you take a sip. We felt like this rule was a must-have because the Candyman in this movie feels much more horrifying than the way that he executed his victims in 1992.
The final rule reappearing from the 1992 installment is that if you see a mirror, you drink. We could have gone a few ways with this rule, such as adding people's reflections, but we decided to simplify it and make this rule the same as the last movies.
Now we will be moving on to the rules that are new and were not in the past installment of Candyman. This list of rules starts with if you see any shadow silhouettes on screen, take a sip.
Next up is a rule that thank God wasn't in the last one. That is because for this rule, you have to take a sip if there is any mention of Helen Lyle. To clarify, this can be things such as seeing photos of her, somebody mentioning her name, or even hearing her speak in some cases.
This is a story about a woman named Helen Lyle.
This next rule goes out to our fans of body horror. Without going too deep into it, take a sip if you see Anthony's hand that was stung by a bee.
Our final rule is that you must drink if you see candy in the movie. This rule actually makes sense for this movie in comparison to the last one, because it appears more than once throughout the whole movie, unlike the last installment. Now that you mention it, that's kind of weird considering the movie was called Candyman.
And that is all for the rules for the most recent installment of Candyman. Again, we do not discuss drinking totals because it's not only more fun to experience the new movies for yourself at the time of watching it, but it's also quite awkward to bring a notepad and pen into a movie theater.
So I guess, without further ado, I'm pretty sure we have a very unanimous decision for this movie thus far. That it's probably the best horror movie of 2021 that we've seen thus far.
That's what I think. So far, it's my favorite movie of 2021 in terms of horror movies, at least. I don't know, it just kind of stepped up above all of the other ones so far. Most of the movies were kind of middle of the road. Maybe some were a little better than others, but this one I feel like blew the others out of the water, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't know, I just feel like it was executed so much better.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of people kind of have the thought that this is just a remake of the first one, and that's kind of what I thought going into it too, is kind of a remake, but it isn't really a remake, it's more of a sequel. And so that being said, it's kind of hard to compare this movie to the original one, just because like it is a sequel, but it has such a different tone than the first one. Yeah. Like the first one is more of like romanticizing pain, and you can really see the romantic side, the romantic element of it, I guess. And whereas this one doesn't really focus too much on the romantic side of things, it goes for the more horrifying tone, I guess.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, like the 92 version has like a lot about romanticizing death, kind of. As this movie goes a lot more for like the kind of like newer movie cliches, so it has a lot of scary imagery, gore, and body horror. Yeah. So some great examples from this movie was like the elevator scene or the fingernails is pretty good.
Yeah, the fingernail scene is good.
Yeah, but it's completely different tones, so it's really hard to compare the movies to each other. So if one person likes one over the other, that's completely fine.
Oh yeah.
Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, of course, but just because they have such different tones, it's hard to compare the two movies together.
Like, I don't even know which one I like better because of it's such a different vibe when you're watching it, I guess. I don't know. I honestly don't know which one I like better. One thing I know for sure that I did like about this Candyman over the other one is that when you saw Candyman, it was mostly in reflections, especially in the first act of the movie. All you saw was reflections of Candyman. You didn't actually get to see him in person. Yeah. And it really made him seem a lot creepier, and that kind of goes into how they went for the scary imagery rather than the romanticizing it or whatever. Because he was kind of a supernatural entity at that point.
Yeah. It's also visually just so appealing to see it. So I know one example that I kind of thought of is there was a scene where he was kind of behind a projector, but you couldn't see him. I love that scene just because of how it's so appealing to look at.
Yeah. And like, I was catching myself just looking for reflections to see if he would pop up in some places, and sometimes he was and sometimes he wasn't, and that kind of added to the, I guess, suspense of it, and kind of brought me more into the movie, I guess.
So I guess the connections in the movie were really well done as well. Without spoiling anything, there's a pretty big twist in the movie. You could probably figure it out by going on the IMDb page for both the new and old Candymans and kind of putting two to two together. Yeah. But then again, it's very hard to figure out, or at least in my opinion, I didn't get until like 5 minutes before it was going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't try and find it out and ruin it for yourself. Yeah. But also, that being said, if you are a huge Candyman fan and like you know basically the original movie like the back of your hand, then you might catch it early on in the movie.
Oh yeah.
But for me, especially, I'm not extremely familiar with Candyman. Like, I've seen it a handful of times, but I don't know it extremely well, and I didn't catch that reveal basically until you brought it up like a minute or two before it happened, and yeah, it was, I think it was done really well, and it was one of my favorite parts of the movie, and one of the reasons it wasn't really a twist ending, it was just a big reveal, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I guess there was an undertone of Helen's search for truth in the last movie, in my opinion. I feel like this one kind of has an undertone for one searching for their destiny. Yeah. So, like, for example, Cabrini Green was always destined to be a cursed place, even though it went through, like, a lot of constructions. Looks completely different from the old movie. I guess it did have the row houses, but it didn't have the apartment complex anymore, which I feel was kind of the big part, in my opinion anyways.
Yeah.
But even, like, when the main part of it is torn down, they try to rebuild it, like, the legend of Candyman still exists. Yeah. Basically, it's destined to stay there forever.
Pretty much, yeah.
As we saw it just kind of brought back to life, like, you can't kind of kill legend.
Yeah, exactly. And just continuing on with Cabrini Green for a minute, there was some other Easter eggs from the movie, such as, like, the graffiti where it was sweets to the sweet. We saw that in the first one. They had the mouth graffiti. It wasn't the exact same, but it was in a doorway, and you can see the mouth around it. So it had a similar feel to the original graffiti that was so prominent in the first one. They had a character that was named Clive, which we felt was a direct reference to Clive Barker, who was
the original writer.
Yeah, the writer for the first one. And then, of course, there was referencing Helen, or even with Tony Todd appearing.
Yeah. And that's one other thing. I'm very happy that Tony Todd reappeared for this movie. If he didn't, I would have been at least a little upset.
Yeah, it was pretty cool to see him.
So I guess one of the good, and you could also say bad parts about the movie, is there was so much gore. But I don't mean that there was too much gore. I mean that sometimes there was a lot of off-screen deaths that you couldn't see and couldn't enjoy.
Yeah, like some of the deaths were really gory, which I personally always like.
Exactly.
And then there were some deaths that were straight up implied, and there was no gore that you saw really.
Yeah. And
I kind of wish that they didn't do the implied deaths. Maybe some implied deaths is fine, but I wish they kind of went more over the top with some of the deaths that we didn't see, and just showed us that gruesome kill like we see some of the other ones.
I think some of them were fine, but it gets to a point where it's a little bit redundant. I mean, there was one death scene which I was really paying attention to, and it wasn't that I was paying attention to the death itself happening. It was panning out from a house shot in one of the apartment complexes, and as it was panning out, you could see more and more people watching football. Like, oh my god, it must be like a Thursday night football game or Super Bowl. And I'm just looking at all the TVs playing football. I'm like, oh wait, somebody's dying.
Yeah, so I feel like they did that intentionally, and if you've seen the movie, you know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny after, like, because you didn't see the death until it basically happened.
Yeah, I was talking to you during it, and I'm like, oh wait, that guy's kind of dying on the screen.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing that I liked from the original movie a lot better was the soundtrack. It just has that staying power like you get from other horror movies, like, you know, the Friday the 13th, the Halloween, the Exorcist, stuff like that. We've mentioned it before. This soundtrack doesn't necessarily have that staying power like the original one does. It still is an effective soundtrack, and it makes you feel tense in the moment when it's on. But like I said, it just doesn't have that staying power, and it's kind of forgettable, I guess. But as it's going in the movie, it is effective still. So I just like the original for its staying power.
I would say I really like the soundtrack, but I will still also agree that the original soundtrack was better.
Yeah.
So moving on to the characters, I feel like all of them were pretty well fleshed out. The way that they did this is they had a lot of really good flashbacks just kind of revealing what the characters went through in their past and how it was so damn horrific and traumatizing. In these flashbacks, there were some of the deaths that were basically very subtle and just kind of cut. But I feel like that's just so much stronger because you don't get to see the aftermath or anything like that.
Oh yeah, for the flashbacks, I think that's the right way to go about it, is implying the deaths and not necessarily showing the gore involved with it.
Yeah.
And those flashbacks, like pretty much all of them, were so effective in showing us some backstory with the characters involved in the movie, and it really made us empathize with that character, I guess, and kind of feel what they're feeling, I guess. And it was done really effectively. Yeah.
The other reason why I like it a lot more, just how subtle it is, like in the way that like you witness this event happening. Like, for example, if somebody were to like shoot a gun behind closed doors, like even if you were that kid, like you'd be horrified.
Oh yeah. Especially if it's like one of your family members or friends or whoever. Even if it was some perfect stranger, it's still horrific. But it just hits even harder if it's someone you know.
Oh yeah. I guess there's a lot of flashbacks revealing people's backstory in Jordan Peele's film. Like, there's the flashback in Us, for example, with the twist. There's also the one in Get Out where he's just kind of sitting on his couch watching TV.
Yeah.
Or on his bed, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking about Us, so the father from Us in that opening scene is the same actor that plays Anthony in this movie. So that's kind of where he started to get his foot in the door with horror. And I watched an interview with him. He said that he would have never pictured himself being in a horror movie and stuff, but because Jordan Peele really liked him in that small part in Us, and he kind of just got on Jordan Peele's radar, he actually seeked him out for this movie, and that's why he kind of got the main role in this movie. And he actually he was pleasantly surprised with how fun it was to act in a horror movie.
He did great.
Oh yeah, I really think it was good. And just in general, the casting was really well done, I thought, for pretty much every character.
Yeah.
So with all that out of the way, what was your overall thoughts about this movie?
Well, again, I feel like we summed it up at the start the best.
Yeah.
Probably the best horror film of 2021 thus far that we've seen anyways.
Yeah.
For the most part, I was almost always on the edge of my seat. The pacing for the film was great. Actors were good. I really liked the artistic atmosphere too, with everyone being an artist and Anthony drawing so much of Candyman.
Yeah.
It made it kind of intertwine and made the film just so much more visually appealing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the climax is also really well done. And I know you were saying this too, but we feel that it's best that you see the original movie and then you see this. The main reason is you'll just get a lot more out of it.
Yeah, like you'll catch those little Easter eggs like we mentioned early on. You'll spot a lot more references, and not to mention you'll actually understand the reveal that happens.
Yeah.
Like, we have a friend that went and saw the new movie without seeing the original, and he said he hated it, but he hasn't seen the
Yeah.
original, so he really didn't understand it, and we kind of got mad at him for that. But
Yeah.
but I get it. If you haven't seen the original, this one, it might not make too much sense. I think it would still be a good movie, not knowing it. But
I still think it's a good movie on its own,
Yeah.
but you just will get a lot more from it.
yeah, it'll be a lot better. And you'll kind of catch yourself trying to spot those Easter eggs too, which keeps you engaged in the film.
Yeah.
That being said, it won't take you out of the movie if you're trying to look for these Easter eggs, because they don't just shove them in all the time. They just subtly drop them there, and so it still keeps you engaged in the actual movie, not just feeding you Easter eggs to try and be nostalgic or whatever, I guess.
Yeah. So normally, this is where we would talk about our Darwin Award nominees and our Darwin Award winner. But again, to make sure the movie is experienced in full, we will not be handing out a Darwin Award for this movie.
And with all that being said, we hope you enjoyed our look into the new Candyman movie. If you end up playing the game alongside the movie, or if you have any feedback or suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Also, let us know in the comments if you think there was a better horror film made in 2021 so far.
Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss next week's episode, where we are going to be making a drinking game for The Shining with a very special guest star. If you want to check out our most recent video on the first Candyman movie, click on the box on the top right. Or if you want to see a playlist of all the movies we review, click on the box below it. Thanks for tuning in, and this is us saying, cheers to fears.
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn house.